When I was in grade 7, I had the most amazing teacher. He would never test us, yet he knew exactly what we knew and what we didn't know. He knew how to motivate us, inspire us, and most importantly, how to tell a great story. He had endless patience, as some of the students used to play hockey in the back of the classroom. I didn't grow up in Canada, but I grew up in Hockey Town, right next door. But what did we use for hockey sticks? We used his 2 canes. So he was diagnosed with polio as a child, and he needed to use these canes in order to get around. He was born in 1933. This was 19 years before the Salk vaccine was discovered. He became handicapped from this disease. Not everyone was so lucky. Infantile paralysis, or the crippler, as polio used to be called, enters, I know there's doctors will correct me, but it enters the body through the mouth, and from the intestines it could spread to the spine, to the central nervous system, and affect the entire nervous system, which could result in some form of paralysis, or worst case, even death. In the year that the vaccine was discovered, there were 58,000 cases of polio reported. Of those, over 21,000 people were paralyzed, and over 3,100 people didn't make it. I spoke to someone who lived during that period, and they told me that the fear of polio was so pervasive that parents wouldn't send their kids to sleepaway camps, and certainly not to public pools. Even nowadays, there's no known cure for polio, and parents just didn't want to take any chances. But since Jonas Salk discovered and Albert Sabin discovered different vaccines for polio, the incidence of polio has decreased so dramatically that since 1994, at least a year ago, there haven't been any reported cases of polio in Canada, and according to the UNICEF, there have been, in 2014, there were only 500 cases worldwide, and even those were in like third world countries like Nigeria and Pakistan and Afghanistan. But this is not the only success story of vaccines. The word smallpox comes from a Latin word which means spotted, and refers to the raised bumps that a person affected by the variola virus has on his face and throughout his body. But for someone who's affected by smallpox, the word smallpox meant so much more. It meant that he was fighting for his life, and there was a 20–60% chance that he wouldn't make it. And even if he did recover, he could remain blind for the rest of his life. In its heyday, smallpox swept through Europe, claiming the lives of 400,000 Europeans annually. In the 19th century alone, 300 to 500 million people succumbed to smallpox. Whole civilizations were wiped out, like the Incas and the Aztecs, and the Jewish world, special slichos were written, I believe that we still say today, as a response to smallpox. But for now it doesn't exist, except for in different laboratories, one in the US and one in Russia, at least that's the hope. The last case was in 1977. What happened in 1796, in May 1796, there was a Dr. Edward Jenner who found a dairymaid by the name of Sarah Nelms, who was afflicted with cowpox, which is a cousin to smallpox, but less dangerous. He took some pus from a lesion that she had in her hand, and he infected 8-year-old James Phipps with the pus, and he came down with cowpox. Later that year, he wanted to prove, he had a theory that cowpox could prevent smallpox. Later that year, I believe it was June that year, he infected, or tried to infect James Phipps, this 8-year-old boy, with smallpox, but was unsuccessful. He was inoculated against smallpox, and for the rest of he gained lifetime immunity, and this was the beginning of widespread immunization. Since then, at least 16 different vaccines have been discovered, many of which are given to children. Based on what I've read, this has proven to be the single most effective way of preventing disease today. Stanley Potkin, who was the one who discovered the rubella vaccine, said the development of vaccines, along with the development of clean water and antibiotics, made the society that we live in possible. Yet, despite all the positive effects of vaccines, people almost immediately began to fight against it. Some people felt that vaccines were dangerous. They didn't know what it was, at least at the beginning, and even maybe now. People feel that it's dangerous to vaccinate. Christians felt that it was anti-religious. Jews felt that it was against the mandate to walk Tamim Tiyam Hashem L'Kecha, to walk simply with Hashem and just to trust Hashem, rely on Hashem. Don't try to figure out ways to avoid what Hashem wants to bring to the world. And some felt that forcing vaccinations was against one's autonomy, against one's own personal liberties. In 1885, the protest was so great that an anti-protest rally in England brought 100,000 people together to fight against vaccines. In that rally, there was an effigy of Edward Jenner. And a few years before that, the Anti-Vaccination Society of America was formed. And even now, despite how effective inoculation has proven to be, there are many people who ardently defend the right not to be inoculated, claiming that vaccines can cause health issues. They're not so effective, they're not so necessary. And this is the framework of the vaccine. So how does Allah view vaccines? So how does the Torah? Is it considered to be included in medicine, injecting a foreign body into one's own blood? Is that considered to be medicine, therefore permitted? Is it encouraged? Is it obligated? Does one have a person to protect himself by taking vaccinations? What about his responsibility to society? Certain vaccines nowadays, I believe, like the rotavirus vaccine, is taken orally. Would that be included in Baal Teshaksu? There's an isser to eat something that's revolting. What about a disease? To eat a disease, would that be included in Baal Teshaksu? There's many very interesting questions that come up. What happens if, time permitting, hopefully we'll get to, but does if a shul, a camp, a youth group, do they have a right to reject kids that aren't vaccinated because they feel that they're threatening the rest of the children? Does Dina de Malchusa Dina play a role over here? The law in Ontario is that you should vaccinate unless, hopefully we'll get to that. As a disclaimer, obviously before I begin, I look around the room, there is at least one doctor I know, so I always get nervous. But I could say very honestly, I am not, and I didn't study medicine. What I did do was any like medical fact. Where did I get that from? I got it from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and from what I understand, it's based on the general normative medical view. And even besides that, I spoke to many doctors, but any fact basically comes from there, unless I point out otherwise, unless I indicate otherwise. So just to begin, besides looking out for our spiritual well-being, the Torah instructs us that we have to take care of our physical health as well. The last siman in Shulchan Aruch, in Choshen Mishpat, siman Tav Chav Zayin 427, tells us that any situation which is dangerous has to be avoided. It must be removed. So, for example, the Shulchan Aruch tells us if someone has a high roof and children are playing on the roof, or that roof is being used, so there's an obligation to build a fence around that roof. If someone has a pit in his backyard, a deep hole, so people walk to the backyard, there's the possibility that they'll trip, and therefore that has to be removed by building a fence around it. And furthermore, besides that, any activity which is considered to be dangerous, let's say skydiving. So most people over 40 will say skydiving is dangerous. Swimming in shark-infested waters, I think at any age people agree is dangerous. So this is a biblical commandment. This is a chiyuv midoraisa that a person, it's derived from the psukim, l'sasim damim, and hishama lecha shmar nafshecha, that a person has an obligation, first of all, to remove any danger which is imminent, and also to avoid any situation which is imminent, which is dangerous. And besides these examples which I listed, there are many other examples of this as well. But the first category is the Oraisa category, the biblical category. It includes any danger which is imminent must be avoided or removed, if possible. Besides the Chiyuv Midoraisa, besides the biblical obligation, the Rabbanan added other things that a person has to avoid, even though the danger is not as imminent as those dangerous situations in the first category. So, for example, in the times of Chazal, in times of the Gemara, it was forbidden for a person to drink water, any liquid that was exposed. So that means if someone left out, let's say, a cup of water, and he left the room for a half hour, or whatever the time is, and then he came back, he couldn't drink the water. What was the reason for that?
Snake.
Because there's a snake, right? Like everyone's saying that there's fear that maybe a snake came, drank the water, it was a poisonous snake, it left some venom behind. And how often did that happen? I mean, it really didn't. The Ramosha writes in a tshuva, he says, he says, Be'isr Galoi, in number 3, Hayarak she'af shachshach, Deshasa hanacha shuchshash urachak. It was like a very remote possibility, it was very rare that a snake would drink, and if he drank, he would have to inject venom. Like, that didn't happen every day. But yet the Rabbanan said, because there was a real possibility, as remote as it was, if everyone would say, you know what, I'm willing to take the risk, I want to drink, what's the odds that a snake came and drank from this water and left venom behind? If everyone would take that approach, then some people would end up getting sick or worse. Therefore, the Chazal said, it's forbidden for everyone to drink. Another example, that halacha says, is that it's forbidden to drink from water and from ponds at night. What was the concern there? The concern there is a person will drink water from ponds, there'll be leeches in the ponds, and he'll end up drinking leeches. Now, what was the possibility of that? Most ponds don't have. And if they do, he has to take the water where the leeches are situated. Like, what are the odds? But because there was a real possibility, as remote it was, and if everyone says, you know what, I'm willing to quench my thirst, and I'm willing to take the risk, the odds are so small, then some people will end up ingesting leeches. So therefore the Rabbanan said everyone is forbidden to drink from pond water at night.
Does that mean that an Orthodox Jew cannot play any sport whatsoever?
There's actually a tshuva from Moshe. I've actually maybe mentioned that tshuva. Yeah. Someone asked Moshe this question. If you want to jump ahead and foot at number 5, source 5. But and just one third example, the halacha says a person can't put coins in his mouth. Right? There's a concern of germs, and therefore they forbade putting coins in one's mouth. And kids do it all the time, and most kids are okay. Yet we still see, since there's a real possibility, if everyone does it, they will be infected. So therefore Chazal said that it was a problem. So those are the first two categories of dangerous situations that a person has to avoid. He has to avoid which is included in the biblical commandment, imminent danger, and then the rabbinic things, that a danger that if everyone takes that risk, there's a possibility, some people will get injured or will get hurt. That's the second category. And finally you have the third category, which the Rambam writes in Hilchos Deos that in order for a person to be able to function at his full capacity, he has to take care of himself, which include in this category is exercising, eating healthy, all the things that we take on ourselves this time of year. That's the truth. But so these are the three categories. You have the imminent danger, which is the Raisa, the danger, which is there's a possibility, but it's more remote, it's not imminent, that's the Rabbanan. Finally, you have the Rambam's thing that a person has to take care of himself. And it would seem, based on this framework that we have, that there should be an obligation to inoculate oneself, one's children. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 2 million deaths each year are prevented from immunization. Just in 1974, there was a major drop in immunization in the UK. And that year, 100,000 cases of whooping cough, some resulting in death, occurred. We see that it seems that there's a real danger not to immunize. And therefore, based on this, it would seem that a person would have to vaccinate. And even if a person wants to argue, the risk is not so great, so it's not imminent, so it's not a chiyuv d'oraisa, it's not a biblical obligation, but it would seem, based on this, that there should be at least a rabbinic obligation to take vaccinations. In 2014, there was an outbreak of measles which affected primarily the unvaccinated Amish community. So you see that vaccination is important, and if people don't, there's a real danger. And therefore, if not a chiyuv midaraisa, there should be at least a rabbinic obligation to vaccinate. But obviously the question of vaccination is not so open and shut, otherwise we wouldn't all be here today. Because really, all the activities that we mentioned, if you go through them, none of them involve a danger. It's not dangerous to avoid putting coins in one's mouth. Building a fence around the pit, unless you don't know how to hold a hammer, is really not so dangerous. Right? And if you do, you hire someone else. But it's not...
That's my solution.
Right. That's the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says that, right? That sukkah is a mitzvah kalam. So everyone, all the guys, what does it mean, mitzvah kal? You have to build. What does that mean? It's an easy mitzvah. It's not an easy mitzvah, but that's it. Right? So, and vaccines, on the other hand, there are side effects. Right? The DTaF vaccine, which is used to inoculate against diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough, does have a side effect. That is like the highest, from what I read in this from the CDC, again, the highest side effects. So what are the side effects? Most mild side effects, I don't think halacha would, like fussiness, halacha I don't think considers to be a risk at all. Any major side effect, it's like so rare that halacha doesn't, but there is some side effect, let's say high fever could affect 1 in 16,000, which is very remote, but there's a risk. Or a small seizure could affect 1 in 14,000. So again, they're very, very, obviously it's extremely safe, but there is some sort of risk. So maybe you could argue that this would affect the obligation to inoculate oneself. Why? Because as we mentioned, it's forbidden to engage in any risky behavior. So it could be argued that even if the risk a person is taking is to avoid a greater risk, the danger that a person is putting himself in is to avoid a greater danger, still it should be forbidden. Like the Gemara in the Chulin says, that suffix sakana, we go l'chumra. That means even when things that we have a suffix about, we have a doubt about, when it comes to Allah, we'll say, it's such a, you could be makel in this situation, whatever the situation is, you could be lenient. But if that same doubt had to do with one's own life, then we would say, no, you can't be lenient at all. You have to be machmir, you have to be concerned. And we do find such a precedence in this line of reasoning. There's an old, when, before even vaccine, there's a pamphlet called Ala Trufa. So what's Ala Trufa? There was a pamphlet written by Avram ben Shlomo Hamburger. It was written in 1785. So this is 11 years before the smallpox vaccine was discovered by Jenner. So he describes over there was a process, it's called variolation. It was a primitive, crude procedure, to inoculate oneself against smallpox. The way it was done, they would take some sort of pus or matter from someone who had already been affected by smallpox, and they would give it to someone who hadn't yet been affected. And the point was that they wanted to cause the person who was not yet affected and for him to come down with like a mild case of smallpox. And if he comes down with a mild case of smallpox, the body would be able to fight that, and then he would gain lifetime immunity. So he describes he describes over there, if one wants to see afterwards, but he describes over there how his own 2 children, they were taken by smallpox, and it's almost, you see like the underlying plea that he's asking the Rabbanim to allow this process of variolation. It seems like there was some people were for it, some people weren't. He describes later there was a risk, 1 in 1,000 people it didn't help, and that was the end. But he still wanted people to go and undergo this procedure of variolation, and he writes over there that people should do it, and he presents this to the Rabbanim of his time. But he begins this whole pamphlet by building a case that it should be forbidden. And he says the reason, like we said, is because there's a small risk involved. What he calls small is considered a very large risk in our days. But he said there's a small risk involved, and maybe it should be forbidden because it's forbidden to engage in a small risk to avoid a greater risk, a small danger to avoid a greater danger. And he says we find such a precedent from that in a couple weeks ago Parsha. Because what happened? Yaakov, there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael. There was a famine in Egypt and all the countries around Egypt. Yaakov sent down his children to Mitzrayim. They went down to Egypt. They meet Yosef over there, and they come back with food and the following message. We can't go down to Egypt unless Binyamin comes with us. That means we can't get any food unless Binyamin comes. And we know, of course, Yaakov says, no, he's not going. So Yehuda tells the brothers, just wait. Food will run out, then he'll go. So that didn't work because the food ran out, and Yaakov says, I'm still not sending him. It was only after Yehuda promised and said, I'm going to take responsibility for him, I'm going to ensure that he'll be safe, that nothing will happen to him when he goes, did Yaakov acquiesce to Binyamin going down to Egypt. So says the Ali Trufa, it doesn't make sense, because what happened? Either way Binyamin was in danger. If he stays home, then there's no food. If he goes down, there's it's a danger, but it's a small danger. The other danger is much worse. They don't have any food. So it seems clear, says Ali Chufa, that to put oneself in a small danger, to avoid a greater danger, that should be forbidden. And therefore he says, based on this, it would seem that vaccination, or in his case, the process of variolation should be forbidden. But if you follow this logic to its conclusion, so what happens? That means if a person has, let's say, strep throat, he cannot drive to the pharmacy to pick up the prescription, because driving is dangerous. So he can't put himself in a small risk in order to avoid a bigger risk. The whole idea seems preposterous. So what does it mean? That a person can't put himself in a small risk to avoid a bigger risk, a small danger to avoid a bigger danger. What is the Ali Chufa saying? And maybe if we understand that, we'll see that it doesn't really have any bearing on the question of vaccination. Because
by that last example, I mean, it's a risk that you would put yourself in whether or not you.
That's what we're going to get to. Yeah, so that's the what we're going to get to. So it seems like everyone undergoes risk, and everyone does certain activities which are risky, which are dangerous. From my understanding, that most people arrived here from the very risky way of driving a car, right? I just, not to scare anyone, but I have over here a sheet that says, what are the odds of dying from? And it's from the National Center for Health Statistics. So he goes through different things that say the odds of dying from a lightning strike is 1 in 100,000, almost 200,000. And he goes through each one. Do you know what the odds of getting into a car crash are? The odds of getting into a car crash are 1 in 112. Which means if you take that number, I could show anyone afterwards, but if you take that number, it's more than 100 times more dangerous to drive to get the vaccine than to actually get the vaccine. If anyone wants to believe they can do it. But that, I mean, it's really an amazing stat. And then the odds of dying, odds of getting into a plane crash are 1 in just over 8,000. I mean, and we do that all the time. So obvious, and no one, we don't find the Rabbanim getting on and saying, it's usher to drive, it's usher to do all these things. So what risk then? We have to, obviously it seems like the risk, it doesn't depend on statistics. So how does halacha consider something to decide what's risky and decide what's not risky? So it seems, and the poskim seem to divide risk into three categories. You have what's called permissible, these are my terms. Permissible risk, actions that involve some risk, but are permitted for compelling reasons, and actions which are so risky that are generally forbidden except under extenuating circumstances, which is a whole different discussion. So when halacha discusses risk, just to explain the three categories, so when halacha discusses risk, it doesn't look, again, like we mentioned, it doesn't look at statistics. It looks at what is society, like you mentioned, what does society accept to be acceptable risk? Everyone in the society drives. So even though the risk is very high, and maybe when cars were just invented it would have been forbidden to drive, but since everyone nowadays drives and everyone flies in airplanes, so therefore halacha says it's not risky at all. Like the term the Gemara uses, dashva rabim, since everyone does it, shomer p'sayim Hashem, Hashem guards the foolish people. Halacha says it's not risky at all. That would be
you're not acting outside of the norms.
Right, right. And you could do these things, therefore, since it's not a risk, you could do that just because. I want to drive. Why do you want to drive? No reason. I just want to drive now. I just got my license, so therefore I want to drive. That would be fine, because society accepts it. That's within the norm of society, and therefore it's okay. The second category would be risk that is permitted for compelling reasons. And that includes low-risk activities which people don't generally engage in unless they have a really good reason for it. I say general anesthesia. People don't just say, I want to get general anesthesia. Right, exactly. I need to get away. I was thinking about it. But yeah, people don't travel across the desert. And those things, unless they're for a good reason, shouldn't be done. You mentioned about ball playing. So someone actually asked Ramosha. So he asked Ramosha the other way. He said, I'm nervous. Apparently it sounds like I'm nervous, I may hurt someone else. So Ramosha in that Tshuva writes over there, the Gemara in Baba Metzia and Daf Kufim Beis, seems clear that a person could engage in risky behavior for a livelihood. That's considered to be a compelling reason. So things that do involve risk. Over there, he's speaking. The Gemara over there is discussing climbing a tree. So climbing a tree, it could be risky, especially if he's doing work on the tree. Yet that's permitted for compelling reasons. So that's the second category. But let's say for someone to get cosmetic surgery just because, that wouldn't be a good reason. So therefore, that may be a question.
All right. So now, does that depend on the level of risk? And I'll make it very simple. Professional football players with a
Right.
major risk of concussion. So L'Chaira, they have it's a Parnassus reason, which L'Chaira would be monitoring yet.
Yeah, so there will be certain risks at a certain point. So that and then halacha will look a little bit at stats. That they there already is a machlokes 1 in 16. I mean, that's already the svidation, these not the svidation, the imrayation, others. That we will look. But the third category, which we're not going to discuss, is really those of high risk. So based on this, it would seem that it just seems that the Ali Chufa would not forbid things that are in the first category.
For example, going to war, there's a big risk, but there's a better purpose for doing it, or a higher purpose.
Right. So then, if it would fit in the second category, then there's a
What would be with smoking? Or is that
smoking. That would be in the first things. That would be the danger. That's either first category danger or second category danger. Then you could argue is the danger imminent or is the danger not imminent.
like a society accepts?
A society now, I don't know if it's so acceptable.
That's what I'm saying. It's changing.
In the olden days, Rav Moshe has a truth about smoking. When he's using the society in the olden days, in his time. But now, society doesn't really. I don't think.
So he said not tshuva what?
So
Was that a different topic?
So I think that's a different thing. That's more like the first things. I think he says that one shouldn't, but
Even though it was a norm.
But it was it was a bad habit. I think he said it was like a bad habit, but that I don't remember 100%.
So what would be the difference between skiing and skydiving? Because both of them result in injuries, but it's just a matter of percentages.
And more people ski.
But people do it.
But people do both.
And most people don't say, where I hang around, people say, okay, you know what, over the weekend it's snowing, the weather's great, we have off, let's go skiing. No one says, hey, it's a clear sky outside, you know, let's go skydiving. People just don't say it, it's not.
You don't play football while you ski.
Yeah, so that's just to continue. So it seemed based on this. So again, just going back. So we have the different categories of risk, and it would seem that if that the Ali Tshuva would not say that the first level of risk is forbidden. So it seems he must be speaking about the second category, that society as a whole didn't accept the risk, and it's clear from the Tshuva that he's writing that that's the purpose. The reason why he wrote the Tshuva was in order to encourage people to undergo variolation. That means society as a whole did not say that one should undergo a variolation. Therefore, he's more speaking about the second category. And therefore, when it comes to vaccination, since as a whole society does vaccinate, it's considered to be the norm, Halakha doesn't see any risk involved in vaccination. And it would be no different than, just as a very extreme example, eating. Eating involves risk. You know, there's a halakha when it comes to Hilchos Yom Kippur, that a person has to say vidui before the Suda Mafsekes. And the Paiskim explain why. Because there's a risk a person may choke.
Yes.
Eating's risky, and yet obviously that's permitted. So halacha would say, just as an extreme example, but halacha would say, when it comes to halacha, there's no risk. So to undergo vaccination, therefore, there's really no question. Furthermore, there's a Ramban, very interesting Ramban in Torah Sa'adam. He writes over there, we know that there's a pasuk in the Torah of Yerapa that a person's allowed to go to a doctor. And really all the Rishonim struggle with, why do I need a heter? And the Ramban has a very interesting reason. He says every medicine, the way it works is because it's powerful. Anything powerful usually will have a side effect. So ask her, who said I'm allowed to take medicine if there's a danger that comes along with it? Every medicine has side effects. If a person gets strep, a child gets strep, they give him amoxicillin. So I looked up what are the side effects of amoxicillin, and I don't want to tell you. But there's a risk involved, and says so. Therefore, the Ramban says that's why you need a pasuk for Rapo Yerapa to tell me that even though medicine is has side effects, it's still permitted. And therefore it seems that that a person would have an obligation to inoculate based on this, which is really what the Shulchan Aruch writes in Yoredeya. And the Mishnah Berurah also says that if there's a plague in the city, a person should flee from the city. And the Mishnah Berurah writes this also. He says, "Vashla kasav dechol echad yavriach banav min ha'ir be'es hazos dehi machla misnabekes." If there's a plague in the city and that's contagious, a person should run away from the city. And this would apply very aptly to when it comes to vaccinations. There are certain viruses that are contagious. A person should run away. So nowadays we don't run away physically. We have a different way of running away. And those days there were it was dangerous to run away. The roads, they didn't have cars. They had less of a danger because they didn't have cars. But they didn't have cars, and therefore it was dangerous. But no different than taking. Halacha would say no different than taking or undergoing vaccinations. So that seems, but again, it can't be so simple. Because there's another argument. Some want to argue that since vaccinations have become so widespread, and the incidence of diseases which children are immunized against have decreased so dramatically, just as, again, a couple stats. In 2013, the incidence of tetanus dropped 96%. Rubella, 99%. There were just 9 cases reported that year, just to mention a couple. So some argue that the potential of catching any of these diseases is so minimal that since there's so few people infected by it, and they're protected by what's called herd or community immunization, which means that let's say I'm the only one in society who doesn't get immunized. So since everyone else around me is immunized, the virus has no way to get to me. That's what they'll argue. But if you follow that argument, so what happens if everyone in this room decides, you know what, everyone's getting immunized, so I don't have to get immunized. I'll rely on herd immunity or community immunity.
And you have what happened in England.
Exactly. The problem with that, like you were saying, that there's a limit to certain vaccines. They're not all 100% effective. Let's say like the smallpox vaccine was. And a lot of these vaccines rely on herd immunization. Just for example, the vaccine against measles to be 100% effective needs 95% of the society to vaccinate. Mumps, 90%. And therefore it means if less than this amount of people vaccinate, then there's a danger. According to the UK Health Protection Agency, because there was a drop of people being vaccinated against measles in 2008 to between 80 to 85%, that means that the majority of society vaccinated, there was an outbreak, and there was an outbreak of measles, even though it was totally eliminated from the country 14 years before that. And it resulted in people dying.
So it's a danger to people, even people who got vaccinated, because it's not 100% effective.
Yeah, it's a danger even to people vaccinated, but most people, from what I've read, most people, there's a bigger danger if you're not vaccinated.
Right.
You're not vaccinated.
Exactly.
But I mean, you're doing a disservice to the
Yeah.
community at large by not vaccinating
You're doing
yourself.
this, right, exactly. Yeah. And that's what's happening right now. I read earlier this year that in Ontario there was a outbreak, I believe, of measles in 7 people. But I mean, it was one family. You know what I find most amazing about that is to say there's an outbreak with 7 people. No one say there's a flu outbreak with 7 people because it's totally eliminated. To have anyone is already considered out of the norm. That's what I found so fascinating about that. You see how important immunization is, or how effective it is, I should say. And then right now there's, let's say, outbreaks you find in the tri-state area. Every once in a while, I believe right now, I didn't check, but I believe right now there's an outbreak of whooping cough, what I've been told again, but that I didn't check. So the question now, we just have to now rephrase the question. The question becomes now, it seems that because people vaccinate, there's no inherent risk, right? People have been going around not being vaccinated, and they're relying on this herd immunity, even though it's not, like we said, 100% effective. But now, what's my responsibility as an individual? Do I have a right to say I'm going to rely on this, since it's not inherent, there's no inherent risk, and therefore I'm going to forego inoculation? Or does one's individual obligation to himself, and really to society as a whole, compel him and mandate that he undergo vaccination. That becomes now the question. So it seems that there's two approaches amongst the poskim. The first approach, and this is the approach from what I've seen the majority of the poskim, including Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Neuwirth, that although a person should listen to a doctor and should inoculate himself, there's no obligation. The Nishmas Avram adds, and he says that, but there would be a mitzvah too. So meaning, even though there's no obligation, if one does undergo vaccination, there's a mitzvah. He says, the Mishnah Berurah writes, mitzvah lahanig atzmo b'mida tova. A person should be manig himself, should act in a way that's good. V'anhaga tova, what's one of the ways that is proper and beneficial, is lishmor briyusa, to guard his health. Kidei sheyabari v'chazak la'avodas habari yisala. In order that he be healthy and strong in order to do the proper thing. And that comes from the Torah. And really we saw this earlier from the Rambam. The Rambam said in Hilchas Deis, Hoyo v'hayos haguf bari v'shalom midarki Hashem. In order for someone to serve Hashem properly, he should be healthy and wholesome. Because it's impossible for one to gain any awareness of Hashem, any appreciation, if he's not well. Therefore, a person has to do his utmost to avoid things that would be ma'abed, that would destroy the body. And that's and even according to this approach, Rav Shlomo Zalman has a tshuva, and he writes there are certain situations that even on Shabbos a person would be able to vaccinate. That means there's no obligation, but a person should, and there's a mitzvah to. That's the first approach. The second approach in the poskim is that of Rabbi Yosef. He was quoted in a book written by Rabbi Tatz. He writes over there that a person would be obligated to vaccinate. That means it's not just a mitzvah, but he maintains that it's an obligation. And the reason he gives is very interesting. Is not because that's his obligation. He has an obligation to society, but he says that's considered to be the normal practice, and a person has to do what's normal to guard his health. Therefore, he says if a person doesn't vaccinate, he's considered to be negligent, even. That's the second approach. So we have the two. So really it comes out that there's a very small disagreement between the poskim. On the one hand, you have Rav Shlomo Zalman, Rav Neuwirth, in that school that says there's no obligation, and a person can't be compelled to, but they only disagree about whether a person is obligated to. I'm sorry, he can't be compelled to, but there's a mitzvah to do so. And Rabbi Yosef says he can't be compelled to. So what's the reasoning of Rav Shlomo Zalman? So it seems that there's two ways to understand it. One way to understand it is the reasoning like we mentioned. Since most people do it, so therefore those who want could rely on that. And that, I believe, is the understanding of Herschel Schachter. He was quoted in an article written in Contemporary Halachic Issues in 2001, where he makes this argument, since the possibility is so small now that one would not have to vaccinate. I spoke to Shlomo Miller, and he told me that the way he understood the opinion of Rav Shlomo Zalman was that because we don't know 100% what the side effects are. We don't know what will be 50 years down the line, 100 years. We don't know 100%. We know it's effective, and we assume it's safe, and it seems to be working. But since we can't know 100%, so therefore, if the language of the Nishmas Avram, the way when he quotes Rav Shlomo Zalman is, if a parent is scared and concerned, so therefore he has no obligation. That's the way Rav Shlomo Miller explained it to me.
On that basis, I mean, you could say you don't know the effect of use of cell phones. There's no benefit to equity, so why can you use them?
No, so
the unknown.
No, so you're allowed to use it because society accepts the use of cell phones. You're not taking a risk.
Okay.
Could I force you to use a cell phone? Could I obligate you to use a cell phone? Then maybe not. You could maybe use that same argument. That is true. So that seems to be the approach of the poskim. Either there's no obligation, but it's a mitzvah to, and one's encouraged to do so, but he can't be obligated because the risk is so small, or because we can't say 100% that it comes without any real side effects. And the other approach is that one is obligated to, is obliged to undergo vaccination. And there's just to throw out one more point, I got the 2-minute warning. So
we know the majority then?
What do you mean by the
Well,
Mishnah?
because you said, one says there's no obligation, and the other one said
These are-
would be
So
obligation.
that I can't. There's a Rav in the shul that I can't. But just to throw out one more factor, we mentioned earlier with Dina de Malchusa Dina, so the law in Ontario says that one's obligated to vaccinate their children, and it gives two exceptions. One is for religious reasons, which based on what we said doesn't seem to apply to us. And then there's what's called conscious reasons. I spoke to a very prominent lawyer, and it came out that really it means my conscience doesn't allow it. And if a person can make that statement, then according to law he wouldn't be obligated to vaccinate. And therefore it would seem that there is a way out to avoid Dina Malchusa Dina. But if, let's say, there is no way out, Shlomo Miller told me that a person would be obligated to, and Rav Hershel Schachter is also quoted saying that a person would be obligated to vaccinate. And just to end off, I just wanted to conclude with, I mentioned earlier and throughout this, the pamphlet Ale Trufa. So I just wanted to end off with one paragraph from him. He says, and it's a paraphrase of a paragraph. So again, this was a tshuva that was written in 1785 to encourage people to undergo variolation. He says, but the straight path for the straight person is to do anything that will strengthen his body in order for service of Hashem. And then he says, V'zeha isha Yisraeli, and this Jewish individual, Hamishtadel b'refuah zu, who undergoes this refuah, which in his terms meant variolation, in our terms will mean vaccination. V'tola b'tchona be'elokav harofei neman, and he turns to Hashem and places his faith in Hashem, the true healer. Tov v'yasher, he's a good and straight individual. V'yisav bracha v'refuah me'is Hashem lazeh. And he'll be blessed and have refuah for Hashem on this. And how much more so nowadays that we should take these words to heart, where the risk is so much less. Thank you for listening.